On a quiet winter afternoon, Miss Marple steps into an old manor, where silence feels deliberate and walls seem to listen. The village speaks politely of charity and comfort, yet small unease lingers in glances and pauses. Footsteps are whispered about never quite reaching the stairs. Miss Marple smiles, gently knowing that when a house holds its breath, it is usually hiding a truth waiting patiently for the observant listener. Chapter 1. The first thing anyone noticed was not the cold, but the silence. It sat in the entrance hall of Linton Manor like an extra guest, unannounced yet impossible to ignore. Mrs. Webb from the village would later say she felt it press against her ears the moment she stepped inside, as though the house expected her to whisper, even before she understood why. Miss Marple arrived just before dusk, her arrival modest and without fuss. She removed her gloves slowly, observing the way the heavy front door closed behind her with a soft finality, the sound swallowed almost at once. The hall was large without being grand, paneled in dark wood that had been polished too often and recently. A long runner carpet stretched toward the staircase, its pattern slightly faded down the center, as if many careful feet had followed the same path for years. She paused there, not out of fatigue, but out of habit. Miss Marple had learned long ago that places spoke if one gave them a moment. The air felt held, not stale, not warm, simply paused. Voices from the drawing room drifted in faintly, softened by distance and thick walls, while the hall itself remained oddly bare of echo. Mrs. Linton swept forward to greet her, cheeks flushed with the pleasure of hosting once more. She spoke warmly about the charity weekend, about old friends returning, about how wonderful it was to see the manor alive again after such a long, quiet spell. Yet even as she talked, her hand brushed the wall beside her chair, fingertips lingering for a fraction of a second before withdrawing, as though checking something unseen. Miss Marple noticed this and said nothing. Tea was served promptly, the tray placed carefully on a small table near the hall window. Mrs. Linton poured with practiced ease, the cups aligned neatly, though one saucer sat a shade closer to the edge than the rest. She laughed softly about village matters, about how everyone was eager for the reopening, about how charity brought out the best in people. And then, as if recalling something amusing, she lowered her voice just a little. "It is a curious thing," she said, smiling, "how old houses have habits. This one, for instance, seems to walk at night." The remark was delivered lightly, but the spoon in her cup paused mid-stir. Miss Marple looked up with polite interest. Footsteps, Mrs. Linton continued, waving her hand as though dismissing a child's fancy. "Late ones. They never go up the stairs, mind you. Just along the hall. Back and forth. As if someone is thinking very hard." Miss Marple's eyes moved, not to Mrs. Linton's face, but to the runner carpet, then to the staircase, then back again. She sipped her tea. "How very tiring for them," she said gently. "Walking so late." Mrs. Linton laughed, perhaps a little too quickly. "Oh, quite. Old houses make all sorts of sounds. Pipes, wood settling. One must not be fanciful." Across the room, Mr. Harrow adjusted a stack of papers on the sideboard. He was a tall man with narrow shoulders and a voice that usually settled easily into polite conversation. When Mrs. Linton mentioned the charity's beneficiaries, including a brief reference to future arrangements for the estate, his hand stilled. "Inheritance matters are all settled," he said at once, his tone crisp. "There will be no confusion." No one had suggested there might be. Miss Marple observed how he cleared his throat afterward and shifted the papers again, aligning them more precisely than necessary. She observed, too, how his gaze flicked toward the hall door and back, as though checking whether someone might overhear. Village guests arrived steadily after that. Coats were taken, greetings exchanged, laughter encouraged. The hall filled with bodies and voices, yet it never truly filled with sound. Even with half a dozen people present, there was a strange restraint, as though the walls absorbed noise deliberately. Mrs. Webb leaned toward Miss Marple during a lull and whispered, It does feel odd, doesn't it? As if the house knows things we don't. Miss Marple smiled kindly and replied, "Houses often do." Later, while others admired a display of photographs near the staircase, Miss Marple drifted back toward the entrance. Her movement was slow and unremarkable, the sort that rarely draws notice. She rested her hand lightly against the wall where Mrs. Linton's fingers had lingered earlier. There, just above the skirting board, a thin line of dust was disturbed. Not brushed away entirely, merely shifted, as though something flat had moved out and back again. The rest of the wall bore the even dullness of long neglect. Miss Marple straightened, her expression unchanged. During supper, conversation turned to the past. Someone mentioned how quiet the manor had been these last few years, how few visitors had come and gone. Mrs. Linton spoke fondly of privacy. Mr. Harrow nodded a little too eagerly. A maid refilled glasses and murmured to another about nearly colliding with someone in the hall the night before. Though when pressed, she laughed it off and said she must have imagined it. Miss Marple noticed the quick glance she cast toward the wall near the door. As the evening drew on, people retired gradually. The charity committee discussed arrangements for the morning. Mr. Harrow excused himself to review documents. Mrs. Linton insisted everything was quite in order. Miss Marple took one last slow walk across the hall before retiring. Her footsteps were soft, careful, and yet she felt the curious way the sound seemed to vanish almost before it reached her own ears. She paused at the place where the dust had been disturbed, then moved on. In her room later, she set her handbag neatly on the chair and sat by the window, looking down at the darkened drive. Somewhere below, the manor settled. Wood shifted. Air moved. And yet, beneath those ordinary sounds, there was something else. Something measured. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Not in weariness, but in thought. The village slept, the house listened, and someone, somewhere within those walls, was walking with purpose. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly into the quiet, knew she had just seen the first shadow of a deadly secret. Chapter 2. The disturbance was mentioned first over breakfast, in the casual tone people use when they hope a matter will pass if treated lightly. Mrs. Webb buttered her toast and remarked that she had slept poorly because someone had been moving about in the hall again. She laughed as she said it, yet her eyes sought agreement around the table and did not quite find comfort. Miss Marple listened without appearing to do so. She was seated near the window, the winter light pale and thoughtful against the china cups. She noticed how Mrs. Linton's hand paused in mid-air when the word again was spoken, and how Mr. Harrow, standing near the sideboard, adjusted his spectacles, though they sat perfectly well already. "It is an old house," Mrs. Linton said at once, her voice warm, but pitched slightly higher than usual. Sound travels strangely. A person hears one thing and imagines another. Miss Marple smiled into her tea. Imagination, she had long observed, was most often blamed when reality proved inconvenient. The morning passed with quiet industry. Tables were cleared, lists checked, and plans discussed for the afternoon charity visits. Guests wandered the manor with polite curiosity, admiring what they were meant to admire, and ignoring what felt uncomfortable to name. Miss Marple joined a small group in the entrance hall where Mrs. Linton proudly explained the history of the house. "It has been altered very little," she said. "My family valued tradition." Miss Marple's eyes moved to a large portrait that hung between two doors. It depicted a severe-looking gentleman with calm eyes and a faint suggestion of humor at the corners of his mouth. The frame was heavy and ornate, its gilding dulled by time. "An ancestor," Mrs. Linton said. "He insisted on being remembered." Miss Marple noticed the portrait was hanging slightly off-true. Not enough to draw comment, but enough to catch a practiced eye. She said nothing, By midday, the hall was empty for a time. Most of the guests were out walking or engaged in preparations elsewhere. Miss Marple passed through on her way to the garden door and noticed that the portrait now sat perfectly straight. It was a small thing. Small things often were. She paused, looking up at it with mild interest, then moved on. Later that afternoon, the baker's wife arrived with trays of pastries. She lingered in the hall longer than necessary, her eyes darting toward the staircase, and then back to the door. "I wouldn't care to be here after dark," she said in a low voice, as though the walls might overhear. "Not with all that coming and going." Mrs. Linton laughed politely. "You mustn't listen to village nonsense." "Oh, it isn't nonsense," the woman replied, lowering her voice further. "My niece helped in the kitchen last night. She heard steps stop right under that portrait. Then there was a click. Clear as day, Miss Marple, standing nearby, glanced up again at the painting. Her expression remained one of gentle curiosity. That evening, as guests gathered once more, Miss Marple took a seat where she could observe the hall without seeming to watch it. Conversation flowed easily, but she noted how often eyes drifted toward the portrait, how often voices dipped when footsteps were mentioned. At one point, Mr. Harrow crossed the hall briskly, stopped short beneath the painting, then continued on with a slight frown, as though something had unsettled him. Miss Marple rose a little later and approached the portrait herself. She pretended to admire the workmanship of the frame, leaning in just enough to examine the lower edge. There, half hidden by shadow, was a faint smudge, not dust, but the mark left by hurried fingers, pressed and withdrawn. Behind the frame, wedged carefully where it would not fall, rested a hairpin. It was a simple object, dark and unremarkable, yet it did not belong to any elderly lady in the house. Miss Marple knew that without needing to be told. She straightened, her face serene. Dinner that night was a lively affair, the sort meant to reassure and distract. Mrs. Linton played her role well, smiling, encouraging laughter, steering conversation away from anything too thoughtful. Mr. Harrow spoke at length about schedules and charitable aims, his tone efficient, his posture composed. Yet when Miss Marple mentioned, quite casually, that she had admired the portrait earlier, his fork paused before reaching his mouth. "It was moved recently," she said lightly. "One notices such things." Mrs. Linton laughed at once. "Oh, surely not. It has always been there." Mr. Harrow swallowed and smiled. "Frames settle," he said. "Houses shift." Miss Marple inclined her head. Of course, as the evening wore on, a maid whispered to another about polishing silver twice in one afternoon because Mr. Harrow insisted it had already been done. Both claimed to have been in the same room at the same time. The matter was laughed away. Yet Miss Marple noticed how the maid's voice faltered at the end of the tale. Later still, when most had retired, Miss Marple walked the hall again. It was quiet, the lamps turned low, shadows stretching long across the runner carpet. She stopped beneath the portrait and listened. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, very softly, there came a sound like fabric brushing wood. A pause, and the faintest suggestion of movement from behind the wall. Miss Marple did not react outwardly. She simply stood, as though lost in thought, until the sound faded and the house returned to its held breath. She returned to her room and sat down, placing the hairpin carefully in her handbag. The portrait now hung perfectly straight, its calm eyes gazing out over a hall that rearranged itself when no one was meant to look. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly into the lamplight, knew she had just watched the house reveal another careful secret. Chapter 3. Sleep, in Linton Manor, was spoken of the next morning with the same careful politeness people used when discussing the weather after a storm. Everyone claimed to have rested well enough. Everyone avoided details. And yet, at breakfast, the air carried a faint strain, like a string pulled just a little too tight. Miss Avery was the first to break the gentle pretense. "I am quite certain the clock struck 12, she said, setting her cup down with deliberate care. "Because I was awake, waiting for it, and directly after, the footsteps began." Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but Miss Marple noticed how she folded and unfolded her napkin as she spoke, never quite finishing the motion. Miss Avery was a slim woman, neatly dressed, with eyes that suggested she had learned to observe before speaking. She glanced toward the hall, as if expecting it to answer her. Mrs. Linton smiled, though the smile took effort. "You must remember that the manor is full of old sounds. People hear what they expect to hear." Miss Avery nodded quickly. "Of course. That is why I listened so carefully. Midnight, exactly. Not before. Not after." Miss Marple lifted her eyes from her plate. Midnight was a precise hour. Too precise, she thought, for something meant to be dismissed as imagination. Conversation drifted to safer ground. Plans for the charity visits. The weather. A remark about how pleasant it was to see the house busy again. Mr. Harrow spoke of schedules and keys and responsibilities, his voice smooth, but his gaze remained fixed on his coffee. Later that morning, Miss Marple accompanied a small group toward the church. The walk was short, the path edged with bare hedges and damp leaves. The vicar's wife fell into step beside her, lowering her voice in the manner of one who possessed information and longed to share it. "It is strange," she said, "how things repeat themselves. I was only saying to my husband that it all feels very familiar." "In what way?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Oh, little disturbances. Quiet worries. Years ago, there was quite a to-do here. A disagreement about papers. Family matters, you understand." She smiled with polite discretion. "It all settled eventually. Or so we were told." Miss Marple nodded. "Matters that settle often leave traces." The vicar's wife glanced at her sharply, then laughed. "You have a very perceptive way of putting things." Inside the church, Miss Marple sat quietly, her attention divided between the gentle cadence of the service and the subtle movements around her. Miss Avery sat 2 rows ahead and turned once, as though to check who might be listening. Mrs. Linton's gaze remained fixed forward, her hands folded tightly. Mr. Harrow arrived late and slipped into a pew near the back, his footsteps soft, his timing careful. Afterward, as people lingered and exchanged pleasantries, Miss Marple overheard a murmured remark about a will that had once been expected and never appeared. It was spoken lightly, almost jokingly, yet followed by a sudden silence that spoke louder than words. Back at the manor, the afternoon passed quietly. Guests rested or read. Miss Marple chose a chair near the hall window and pretended to doze, though her eyes were half open. She watched the way light shifted across the walls, the way shadows settled into familiar places. She noticed something else, too. A faint current of air brushed her ankle now and then, cool and steady, not like the wandering chill of winter, but like breath, drawn through a narrow space. Later, she rose and walked slowly along the wall where the dust had been disturbed the night before. Kneeling with the mild excuse of adjusting her shoe, she pressed her hand near the skirting board. There it was again. A draft. Slight. Persistent. Miss Marple straightened and continued on as though nothing were amiss. In the kitchen that evening, a maid spoke in a low voice to another, remarking that she had heard a sound like metal touching wood during the night. "Just once," she said, "like someone dropping something small." Miss Marple, passing by, paused. "How easily small things are overlooked," she said kindly. The maid smiled uncertainly and said nothing more. Dinner that night was quieter than before. Miss Avery ate little, her attention divided. Mrs. Linton made a point of praising the smooth running of the household. Mr. Harrow nodded along, yet his eyes flicked, now and then toward the hall entrance. After the meal, Miss Marple wandered toward the drawing room, then changed direction and walked instead into the hall. It was empty, the lamps low, the portrait gazing down with its usual calm expression. She stood very still. From somewhere near the wall came a faint sound, almost imperceptible. A shift. A breath. Then, softly, something fell. Miss Marple waited several seconds before moving. When she did, she bent and picked up a small brass screw from the carpet. It was clean and bright, too bright for something that had lain undisturbed. She held it between her fingers, her expression thoughtful. Moments later, Mr. Harrow appeared at the far end of the hall. He stopped when he saw her, his surprise quickly smoothed into a courteous smile. "Admiring the house?" he asked. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It has many small details." His gaze dropped, just briefly, to her hand. "I wonder," she said lightly, "how often people notice what supports a thing, rather than the thing itself." Mr. Harrow's smile tightened. "One must be careful with old fixtures," he said. "They loosen over time." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. She returned the screw to her handbag and wished him a pleasant evening. That night, Miss Avery did not retire early. She lingered in the sitting room, her manner restless. When Miss Marple passed, she leaned close. "I think something is wrong," she whispered. "I think someone is hiding something in this house." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Houses often keep secrets," she said. "But secrets grow tired of being kept." Near midnight, the manor settled once more. Miss Marple sat awake in her room, listening. When the clock struck 12, clear and deliberate, the footsteps began almost at once. They moved along the hall, stopped, then resumed, their rhythm measured. Miss Marple closed her eyes, not in fear, but in concentration. She imagined the path, the pauses, the reason for them. When the sound ceased, she rose quietly and opened her door just enough to hear the hall breathe again. Someone was not merely walking. Someone was checking something. And Miss Marple, gazing into the dark with a kindly smile, knew the house had just shown her how carefully its secret was being guarded. Chapter 4. The teacup appeared without comment, which was perhaps why Miss Marple noticed it at once. It sat among the others on the tray in the entrance hall, its pale blue rim catching the light in a way that felt slightly out of place. The morning gathering had been arranged informally, a few guests lingering after breakfast while Mrs. Linton discussed the day's plans. Cups were lifted, sugar passed, small pleasantries exchanged. Everything was orderly, comfortable, familiar, and yet that teacup did not belong. Miss Marple's eyes rested on it for only a moment, before she looked away. Her expression unchanged. She had lived long enough to know that the smallest irregularities often spoke the loudest, provided one did not stare too hard. Mrs. Linton poured tea with practiced ease, her movements smooth, her voice warm as she spoke about the charity deliveries scheduled for the afternoon. She laughed softly when Mrs. Webb fretted about the cold and assured everyone that the manor was perfectly snug. Miss Marple lifted her own cup and sipped. As she did so, she noticed the faint mark beneath the unfamiliar cup when it was lifted again by one of the guests. A small stamp. A shop mark. The sort used by local traders who supplied everyday wares, not by families who had owned the same china for generations. "How charming these are," Miss Marple said mildly, inclining her head toward the tray. "Such a pleasing pattern," Mrs. Linton smiled. "They have been in the family for years." Miss Marple nodded, as though satisfied, and returned her attention to her tea. Conversation drifted, as it always did, toward village matters. Someone mentioned a delivery from the general shop. Another remarked on how convenient it was to have supplies so close at hand. Miss Marple listened, noting how Mrs. Linton's fingers tightened briefly around her cup when the shopkeeper's name was spoken, then relaxed again when the topic changed. After the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple remained seated a little longer. A maid arrived to clear the tray, stacking the cups carefully. When she reached the unfamiliar one, she hesitated. "That one goes to the pantry," she said, half to herself. "Does it?" Miss Marple asked gently. The maid flushed. I mean, it was set aside earlier. For cleaning, Miss Marple smiled kindly. Of course. Later that morning, Miss Marple found herself near the pantry door as Mrs. Linton supervised arrangements. The door stood ajar, revealing shelves lined with jars and bottles. Miss Marple's gaze moved, not lingering, yet attentive enough to notice a small bottle tucked behind a row of preserves. Its label bore the same faint shop stamp she had seen beneath the teacup. Cleaning fluid, the label claimed. Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Linton shifted her position slightly, blocking the view as she spoke more loudly about luncheon plans. Her voice was steady, but the movement was instinctive. Such a relief to have everything in order, Mrs. Linton said. Nothing worse than disorder. Miss Marple agreed warmly. It does unsettle people. That afternoon, the gardener came in to speak with Mrs. Linton. He removed his cap respectfully and mentioned, quite casually, that he had found the hall window open earlier than expected. Strange thing, he said. The latch sticks something awful. Hardly ever opens unless you give it a good pull. Mrs. Linton laughed. A quick, bright sound. Someone must have wanted fresh air. Miss Marple noticed how her laughter ended abruptly when the gardener added, it would have taken a bit of force. Mrs. Linton's hand moved to her sleeve, smoothing imaginary creases. Well, the house does get stuffy. Miss Marple watched the exchange with mild interest. Old latches, she knew, did not give way easily, especially in winter. As the day wore on, guests returned from their errands, cheeks flushed from the cold. The hall filled briefly with chatter and movement, then emptied again. Miss Marple took advantage of the quiet to walk its length slowly, her footsteps soft against the runner carpet. She paused near the pantry door, listening. From inside came the faint clink of glass, as though a bottle had been shifted. Then, nothing. That evening, dinner was served promptly. The unfamiliar teacup did not reappear. Mrs. Linton seemed more relaxed, her conversation flowing easily, her laughter more natural. Mr. Harrow spoke of accounts and supplies, mentioning how useful it was to make small purchases locally rather than ordering in bulk. Miss Marple noticed how he avoided Mrs. Linton's eyes as he spoke. After dinner, as people gathered near the fire, a maid approached Miss Marple quietly. I hope you don't mind me saying, she murmured, but there was a smell in the pantry earlier. Sharp, like polish, stronger than usual. Miss Marple inclined her head. How curious. I thought perhaps something had spilled, the maid continued, but everything looked quite neat. Miss Marple thanked her and said no more. Later, when most of the guests had retired, Miss Marple returned to the hall. The lamps were low, shadows deepening the corners. She stood for a moment near the pantry door, then stepped closer. The door was closed now, but not quite flush with the frame. She pressed gently. It gave a fraction, then stopped. From within came the faintest sound of liquid shifting. Miss Marple straightened and turned away just as footsteps approached. Mrs. Linton appeared at the far end of the hall, her expression pleasant but alert. Still awake? She asked. Yes, Miss Marple replied. I find I sleep better after a little walk. Mrs. Linton smiled. Do be careful. The house can be deceptive at night. So I have noticed, Miss Marple said softly. She returned to her room and sat by the window, hands folded in her lap. The manor settled around her, familiar sounds rising and falling. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed with deliberate care. Miss Marple closed her eyes, her thoughts orderly and calm. A teacup from a local shop. A bottle tucked away. A window forced open. Small precautions taken quietly, with purpose. Someone was preparing something meant to be unnoticed. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly into the lamplight, knew the pattern was growing clearer, even as the danger edged closer in the dark. Chapter 5. The door was spoken of as though it barely existed, which was precisely why Miss Marple became aware of it. It happened during a gentle conversation after breakfast, when Mrs. Webb remarked that she had never seen the little door off the entrance hall opened, not once in all her visits. The comment was delivered with a light laugh, the sort meant to fill silence rather than invite discussion. Yet the moment it was said, Mrs. Linton's spoon struck the rim of her cup with a sharp, accidental sound. "Oh, that," Mrs. Linton said quickly. "It has been locked for years. Nothing of interest inside. Old storage only." Miss Marple glanced toward the hall, her expression one of polite curiosity. She had noticed the door already. It was narrow, set discreetly into the wood paneling, painted the same shade as the surrounding wall. It did not draw attention. It was meant not to. "How sensible," Miss Marple said gently. "Unused spaces often invite trouble." Mrs. Linton smiled, though her eyes did not quite meet Miss Marple's. The morning passed quietly. Guests moved in and out, coats fetched, plans discussed. Mr. Harrow supervised arrangements with his usual efficiency, keys jingling softly at his belt. Miss Marple observed that he touched one key more often than the others, his fingers brushing it, as though for reassurance. Later, while the hall stood empty for a few minutes, Miss Marple walked its length at an unhurried pace. Her steps were slow, thoughtful, as though she were admiring the paneling. She paused beside the small door and bent slightly, pretending to adjust her shoe. The keyhole caught the light. It was clean. Too clean. The surrounding paint showed the dull wear of age. Yet the metal of the lock gleamed faintly, polished by frequent use. Miss Marple straightened, her face serene. In the afternoon, village gossip drifted in through the open drawing-room door. Mrs. Webb spoke in a hushed voice about unpaid bills and a loan that had been requested and then abruptly declined. Another guest murmured about a sudden improvement in someone's circumstances, unexplained but welcome. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "And then there was the matter of the account books," Mrs. Webb added, lowering her voice further. "I heard they were checked twice last month. Quite unusual." Miss Marple glanced toward Mr. Harrow, who stood near the window speaking to a guest. His tone was calm, his posture relaxed, yet his shoulders stiffened slightly at the mention of accounts. Later that day, Miss Marple found an excuse to speak with him alone. "You manage things so efficiently," she said kindly. "It must be a comfort to Mrs. Linton." He smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "Order is essential in a house like this." "I quite agree," Miss Marple replied. "Especially where locked doors are concerned." His gaze flicked toward the hall before he answered. "Old houses have many doors." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "And not all of them stay closed by habit alone." He laughed lightly and excused himself. That evening, as dusk settled, Miss Marple wandered into the hall once more. The lamps were lit, casting warm pools of light across the runner carpet. She paused near the small door again, listening. Nothing. She turned to leave, then stopped. Something lay half-hidden beneath the side table nearby. A stub of candle, worn unevenly, blackened on one side with soot. Miss Marple picked it up carefully. The soot marked only one edge, suggesting it had been held close to something narrow, perhaps a crack or seam, rather than allowed to burn freely. She replaced it exactly where she had found it. Dinner that night was marked by strained cheerfulness. Mrs. Linton spoke at length about the success of the charity efforts. Mr. Harrow nodded along, contributing practical remarks. Miss Avery listened in silence, her eyes moving from face to face. Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Linton avoided looking toward the hall whenever the conversation lulled. After dinner, guests gathered near the fire. Miss Marple sat slightly apart, her posture relaxed, her attention seemingly on the flames. She overheard a maid whisper to another that she had seen light beneath the small door the night before. "I thought it must be my eyes," the maid said quickly. "It is meant to be locked." Miss Marple lifted her gaze at that, then lowered it again. Later, when the house had quieted, Miss Marple walked the hall for the last time that evening. She stopped beside the small door and rested her hand lightly on the paneling. It was cool beneath her fingers. Very gently, she pressed. The door did not open, but it shifted a fraction, as though meeting resistance from something newly adjusted behind it. From within came the faintest sound, like paper settling. Miss Marple withdrew her hand at once and stepped back, her expression unchanged. As she turned away, she heard footsteps at the far end of the hall. Mr. Harrow emerged from the shadows, his face composed. "Is something amiss?" he asked. "No," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I was merely admiring how secure everything feels." He smiled, though his eyes lingered on the door. "That door," he said carefully, "is best left alone." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course." She returned to her room and sat quietly for some time, the candlelight steady beside her. A locked door used often. A candle held close to a seam. Papers shifting behind wood meant to conceal them. Someone was not simply hiding something. Someone was checking it, guarding it, perhaps even fearing it. As the manor settled into silence, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. The locked door was not locked by neglect, but by necessity, and Miss Marple, gazing into the quiet with gentle certainty, knew that whatever lay behind it was worth far more than its keeper wished the world to know. Chapter 6. The footsteps were different that night, and it was the maid who noticed it first. She mentioned it the next morning while clearing the breakfast table, her voice lowered out of habit rather than fear. "They sounded heavier," she said, almost apologetically. "Slower, too. As if whoever it was had something on their mind." Mrs. Linton laughed at once, a bright sound meant to smooth away discomfort. "My dear, you must stop listening to the house. It will have you believing all sorts of things." The maid nodded quickly, eyes dropping to the tray in her hands. Yet as she turned away, Miss Marple observed the brief glance she cast toward the staircase. It was the look of someone who had noticed more than she wished to admit. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Heavy footsteps suggested not only weight, but intention. People walked differently when they felt pressed by time or thought. The morning unfolded with polite efficiency. Guests discussed their plans, coats were fetched, and the charity weekend continued with an air of determined normality. Miss Marple noticed, however, that the small door off the hall was avoided entirely, as though it had faded into the wall itself. No one stood near it. No one brushed past it. It existed only when one remembered it. As she crossed the hall later, Miss Marple passed close enough to see something new on the paneling beside the door. A faint smear, darker than the surrounding wood. She paused, pretending to examine a vase on the side table, and leaned just enough to inspect it more closely. The mark was at shoulder height, not accidental, not the sort left by furniture or careless hands. It looked like polish, transferred from a sleeve or glove, pressed briefly and wiped away. Miss Marple straightened slowly. At luncheon, conversation drifted toward the past, as village conversations so often did. The vicar's wife spoke softly of a quiet romance from many years ago, one that had ended suddenly and without explanation. "There was a letter," she said, lowering her voice. "Or so people believed. But it was never delivered." Mrs. Linton's spoon paused over her plate. She resumed eating at once, though her appetite seemed to have waned. Miss Marple listened without comment, noting how Mr. Harrow's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he smiled and asked about dessert. After luncheon, Miss Marple walked with Miss Avery in the garden. The winter air was sharp, the paths damp beneath their feet. Miss Avery spoke hesitantly, as though testing each word before allowing it out. "I feel as though I am being watched," she said at last. "Not by a person exactly. By the house." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "Houses notice changes," she said. "They are very sensitive to disturbance." Miss Avery stopped walking. "Someone is pretending," she whispered. "Pretending things are as they always were." Miss Marple smiled gently but said nothing more. That afternoon, a small incident caused more discomfort than it deserved. A guest remarked casually that the hall seemed narrower than before. The comment was laughed away, yet Miss Marple noticed how Mr. Harrow's tone sharpened when he replied. Halls do not change, he said firmly. Only our perceptions. Miss Marple thought of the hidden space behind the wall, of the disturbed dust, and the draft that breathed like a living thing. Perceptions, she knew, were often the first to change when truth pressed close. As evening fell, the household settled into a strained calm. Mrs. Linton moved from room to room, overseeing everything herself, her smile fixed, her movements brisk. Mr. Harrow checked doors and lamps with unnecessary care, his steps precise. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing room, her hands folded, her attention seemingly on the fire. She listened instead to the cadence of the house, the settling wood, the muted echoes, the silence between sounds. When the clock struck midnight, she rose quietly from her chair and moved into the hall. The footsteps began almost at once. They were indeed heavier, as the maid had said. Slower. More deliberate. Each step placed carefully, then paused, then resumed. Miss Marple stood near the foot of the stairs, her posture relaxed, as though she had simply stopped to admire the space. The footsteps reached the area near the small door and halted. There was a faint sound then, like fabric brushing wood. A pause. Then another sound, softer still, like paper being adjusted. Miss Marple did not move. After several moments, the footsteps retreated, fading back into the quiet of the house. Miss Marple waited until the silence settled fully, before turning toward the wall. She stepped close enough to see the smear again, darker now in the lamplight. Gently, she touched the wood just below it. It was warm. She withdrew her hand at once. Behind her, someone cleared their throat. Mr. Harrow stood at the far end of the hall, his face carefully neutral. I did not expect anyone else to be awake, he said. I find I sleep better when I listen first, Miss Marple replied pleasantly. His gaze flicked to the door, then back to her face. This house has a way of unsettling people. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly, particularly when things are not quite as they seem. He smiled, but it was a brittle thing. You are very observant. Only in small ways, Miss Marple said. She returned to her room soon after, closing the door gently behind her. She sat by the window for some time, thinking. Heavier footsteps. A smear at shoulder height. Warmth where none should be. Someone checking something more often now, with greater urgency. Whatever was hidden behind that wall was no longer merely guarded. It was beginning to worry its keeper. And Miss Marple, gazing into the quiet night with calm certainty, knew that the performance in the hall was changing, because the truth was pressing ever closer to the light. Chapter 7. The argument was almost heard. That was how Mrs. Webb would later describe it, with a small shiver and a puzzled frown, as though the words themselves had slipped away before they could be caught. She had been passing the entrance hall shortly before luncheon, when voices rose sharply from somewhere beyond the paneling. Not loud enough to make out words, not clear enough to identify speakers, just the unmistakable sound of tension pulled too tight. By the time she paused, the voices had stopped. At luncheon, no one mentioned it directly. They rarely did. Instead, conversations skirted the edges of comfort, drifting from weather to village news and back again. Miss Marple listened, her attention divided between the table and the subtle shifts in tone that accompanied certain names. Mrs. Linton spoke brightly, yet her laugh arrived a beat too late. Mr. Harrow contributed practical remarks, though his eyes seemed fixed on a point, just beyond the table, as though he were listening for something else. Miss Avery sat very straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze lowered. Miss Marple noticed that Miss Avery did not touch her tea. After the meal, guests dispersed to their various occupations. Miss Marple lingered in the sitting room, ostensibly admiring the view, though the winter garden offered little of interest. She heard footsteps in the hall, then a door opening and closing with careful restraint. Moments later, Miss Avery appeared in the doorway. She hesitated, as though unsure whether to speak, then crossed the room and sat beside Miss Marple. "I almost said something," she murmured. "Just now." In the hall, Miss Marple turned toward her, her expression open and kind. "Almost said something important?" Miss Avery nodded. "I thought perhaps it was time. But then I remembered how quickly words can be turned." Miss Marple said nothing, allowing the silence to do its work. "There is a document," Miss Avery continued, her voice low. "I am certain of it. Something that explains everything, and someone is desperate to keep it hidden." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Desperation often leaves marks. Miss Avery looked at her sharply. "You have seen them too." Miss Marple smiled gently, neither confirming nor denying. That afternoon, Mrs. Linton announced that she would show a few guests the family photographs. The albums were kept in a cabinet near the drawing room, their covers worn from years of handling. Miss Marple joined the small group, taking a seat near the end. As pages were turned and names recalled, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Linton closely. She handled most of the photographs with ease, her comments warm and affectionate. Yet when one particular frame was produced, her fingers faltered. The photograph was old, its edges softened by time. It showed the entrance hall as it had been many years before, the portrait still present, the paneling unchanged. Mrs. Linton held it up briefly, then set it aside more quickly than the others. Miss Marple noticed the back of the frame. It was worn, not simply aged, but handled repeatedly, the backing slightly bent at one corner. "Such a fine likeness," Miss Marple said mildly. "One forgets how little things change." Mrs. Linton smiled tightly. "Some things are best left as they are." Later, when the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered behind. With the mild excuse of straightening the cabinet, she lifted the photograph again and examined the back more closely. The frame had been opened and closed many times. The fastenings were looser than they should have been. Miss Marple returned the photograph carefully to its place and closed the cabinet. That evening, a sense of strain settled over the manor like an early frost. Voices were quieter, movements more deliberate. Miss Marple noticed how Mr. Harrow positioned himself frequently within sight of the hall, his presence subtle, but constant. At dinner, Miss Avery barely spoke. When she did, her voice trembled slightly, though she smiled as though nothing were amiss. Miss Marple observed how Mr. Harrow watched her whenever she spoke, his gaze sharp and assessing. After dinner, as guests gathered near the fire, Miss Marple rose and excused herself. She walked slowly toward the entrance hall, her steps unhurried. Halfway there, she heard it again. Voices. This time, clearer. "You cannot keep this hidden forever," a woman's voice said, low and urgent. "I must," came the reply, tight with strain. "Everything depends on it." Miss Marple paused, just out of sight, her posture relaxed. "There is a letter," the woman said. "Someone will find it." "Not if I reach it first," the other voice replied. The voices fell silent abruptly. Miss Marple waited a moment longer before continuing into the hall. It was empty. Lamps glowed softly. The portrait gazed down with its usual calm detachment. Miss Marple approached the photograph cabinet once more. This time she opened it fully and removed the old frame. Her movements were careful, respectful. She turned it over and examined the backing. With gentle pressure, she eased it open. Inside lay a folded slip of paper, yellowed with age. The writing upon it was faint but legible. A date. A name reduced to an initial. Enough to tell a story, if one knew how to listen. Miss Marple replaced the paper exactly as she had found it. and closed the frame. She returned it to the cabinet and shut the door. As she turned away, Mr. Harrow stood at the far end of the hall. "I wondered where you had gone," he said pleasantly. "I enjoy quiet moments," Miss Marple replied. "They are often very revealing." His gaze moved, despite himself, to the cabinet. "Some things," he said carefully, "are private." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Privacy has its place. Though it can be mistaken for safety." His smile flickered. Later that night, Miss Marple sat in her room, the slip of paper's contents clear in her mind, a date that aligned too neatly with village gossip, an initial that matched a story never properly concluded. The footsteps began shortly after midnight. They moved along the hall, heavier than before, faster now, as though time were pressing. They stopped near the photograph cabinet. There was a brief sound of movement. Then, a sharp intake of breath. Miss Marple opened her door just enough to listen. A hurried step. Another. Then silence. The performance was losing its polish. Someone was no longer confident. Someone feared discovery. Miss Marple closed her door and returned to her chair. She sat quietly, her expression thoughtful, her conclusions firming gently into place. The argument she had almost heard was no longer a mystery. The confession that hovered at the edge of speech was drawing closer. Someone in the house knew the truth. Someone else was trying to keep it buried. And Miss Marple, gazing into the lamplight with calm resolve, knew that the next night would bring the end of Pretence, whether its keeper wished it or not. Chapter 8. The hall felt different, even before anyone gathered there, as though it had already released the breath it had been holding all these nights. Miss Marple sensed it when she stepped out of her room that morning. The house was quieter than usual, not merely in sound, but in intention. The careful restraint that had shaped every movement now felt loosened, like a knot pulled too tight for too long and finally giving way. She walked slowly toward the entrance hall, her steps unhurried, her expression serene. Breakfast passed with polite efficiency. Mrs. Linton spoke warmly about the success of the charity weekend, her tone bright, almost relieved. Mr. Harrow discussed departures and schedules, his voice precise. Yet Miss Marple noticed how often his gaze drifted toward the hall, lingering there as though measuring time. Miss Avery sat very still, her face pale but composed, her hands folded tightly together. Miss Marple drank her tea and said little. It was shortly before luncheon when Mrs. Linton announced that she had asked everyone to gather in the hall for a final word of thanks before guests began to leave. The request was phrased lightly, yet it carried an edge of urgency that did not go unnoticed. Chairs were drawn closer, coats were set aside, voices lowered instinctively. The entrance hall filled slowly, people standing in loose clusters beneath the watchful gaze of the portrait. Lamps were lit despite the daylight, casting a warmer glow than usual, as though attempting comfort. Miss Marple positioned herself near the small door, not drawing attention, merely present. Mrs. Linton spoke first, her voice smooth. She thanked everyone for their generosity, for their patience with the old house and its habits, for indulging what she called village fancies. She laughed gently, though the sound did not quite settle. And now, she added, clasping her hands together, before we all return to our ordinary lives, I think it only fair to put certain matters to rest. A faint stir passed through the group. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly. If you will forgive me, she said kindly, I wonder if I might add something. Mrs. Linton hesitated, just for a moment, then smiled. Of course, Miss Marple. You have been such a comfort to us all. Miss Marple inclined her head. I have noticed, she began gently, how very careful everyone has been these past days. Careful with words. Careful with footsteps. Careful with doors that are said to be locked. Mr. Harrow stiffened almost imperceptibly. Old houses, Miss Marple continued, her voice calm and conversational, do not usually require such effort. They are quite content to be left alone. Unless, of course, there is something within them that requires attention. A murmur ran through the hall. Mrs. Linton laughed again, though it sounded thin. Surely you are not suggesting. I am suggesting nothing, Miss Marple said softly. I am merely observing. She turned slightly, her gaze moving to the portrait. That painting has been adjusted often, more often than a frame ought to be. And when it was moved, it revealed small signs, smudges from hurried fingers, a hairpin placed where it could be reached quickly. Miss Avery drew in a sharp breath. Miss Marple went on, her tone unchanged. Behind the wall, there is a space, a narrow one, but sufficient to hold papers. Papers that have been checked frequently, by candlelight, judging by the soot on one edge of the stub found nearby. Mrs. Linton's face had grown very still. The door to that space, Miss Marple said, gesturing lightly, is said to be locked and unused. Yet its lock is polished by use, its panel warmed by frequent visits. The footsteps we all heard were not accidents of an old house. They were performances, measured, timed, intended to discourage curiosity. She paused, allowing the silence to settle. It was clever, she added kindly. Very clever. At first, Mr. Harrow stepped forward. This is quite enough, he said sharply. You are upsetting people. Miss Marple looked at him with gentle interest. Upsetting truths often do. She turned her attention toward Miss Avery. You knew there was a document. You sensed it because you had once expected it yourself. Miss Avery nodded slowly, tears gathering but not falling. A letter, Miss Marple said, written many years ago. One that explained a choice. A private choice, involving affection and responsibility. It was meant to be delivered, but it was intercepted. Mrs. Linton's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. The letter was hidden behind a photograph, kept close because it was dangerous to ignore and dangerous to destroy. Someone feared that if it were found, arrangements would change. Money would move. Reputation would suffer. Mr. Harrow's face had drained of color. The heavier footsteps came when the pressure increased, Miss Marple said, when the charity weekend brought more eyes into the house, when there was a sudden death that threatened to draw attention where none was wanted. A collective intake of breath followed. That death, Miss Marple said quietly, was not planned. But once it occurred, it became useful. Fear was encouraged. Sounds exaggerated. Blame gently steered away from the truth. Mrs. Linton sank into a chair. Miss Marple turned toward Mr. Harrow. You had access. You had motive. You knew the house well enough to create a spectacle, and you knew exactly what lay behind that wall. Mr. Harrow opened his mouth, then closed it. His shoulders sagged slightly. I only meant to protect her, he said at last, his voice low. Everything depended on it. On silence, Miss Marple corrected gently. He nodded. If that letter had been found years ago, nothing would have been as it is. I did what I thought necessary. Miss Avery stepped forward, her voice trembling. You took my future. Mr. Harrow looked at her, his composure breaking at last. I took nothing. I kept order. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. Order that requires constant guarding is not order at all. It is fear. She gestured toward the small door. The document is there still. Is it not? Mr. Harrow hesitated, then reached into his pocket. He removed a small key, his hand shaking slightly, and unlocked the door. The panel opened with a soft sound, revealing the narrow space beyond. He retrieved the folded paper and held it out. Miss Marple did not touch it. She merely nodded. That, she said, is the truth you have been walking around each night, listening for, worrying over. And now it may finally rest. The hall was silent. Mrs. Linton covered her face with her hands. Miss Avery stood very straight, her eyes fixed on the letter. Miss Marple spoke again, her voice warm. There will be consequences, but there will also be relief. Secrets demand far more effort than honesty ever does. Mr. Harrow bowed his head. I am so tired, he said quietly. Miss Marple smiled kindly. I imagine you are. Later, after arrangements were quietly made and guests began to depart, Miss Marple stood once more in the entrance hall. The portrait hung straight. The air felt lighter. The house no longer listened quite so intently. Miss Avery approached her. Gratitude and sorrow mingled in her expression. Thank you, she said simply. Miss Marple patted her hand. Truth has a way of finding its moment. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, Mrs. Linton came to see her off. Her face was drawn, yet calmer than it had been in days. I suppose, she said softly, the house will be quiet now. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Houses rest when they are no longer asked to keep secrets. The front door closed gently behind her. The sound did not vanish this time. It echoed just enough to be heard, and as Miss Marple walked away from Linton Manor, smiling to herself, she knew the hall would never again hold its breath. The village returned to its gentle rhythms with surprising speed. Doors opened and closed, as they always had. Tea was poured. Greetings were exchanged with familiar warmth. Yet something subtle had shifted, like a clock reset quietly in the night. At Linton Manor, the entrance hall no longer felt watchful. Its silence was ordinary now, the comfortable hush of a house at rest. The small door remained closed, but without tension its purpose finished at last. The portrait hung straight and untouched, no longer adjusted by anxious hands. Mrs. Linton kept largely to herself for a time, her manner subdued but steadier than before. Miss Avery stayed on briefly, reading the letter again in private moments, not with bitterness, but with a thoughtful calm that suggested understanding had finally found its place. Mr. Harrow was spoken of rarely, and when he was, it was with quiet restraint rather than anger. Miss Marple departed without ceremony, as she always did. She carried nothing from the house, but impressions, small details, and the satisfaction that comes from truth gently revealed, rather than forced into the light. Some mysteries end with noise and spectacle. This one ended with release, and long after Miss Marple had gone, the hall remained empty in the best possible way, no longer shaped by fear or guarded secrets, but by the simple honesty of a house allowed, at last, to be just a house.